So, regular listeners may remember that a couple of weeks ago, we covered a new scientific study that showed how the western Antarctic ice sheets are melting, and due to the way the land masses are up there, scientists have said that there literally is no way to stop the ice from melting there anymore. The scientists said essentially that the cork of that bottle has been opened and there's no way to put the cork back in. So, as we covered a couple weeks ago, that western Antarctic ice melt alone is going to lead to a 3-foot rise of sea levels, most likely within the next century. That is on top to an additional 3 to 4 feet that many scientists were already predicting in the next century there. So, that was a bad news story that we covered a couple weeks ago. Well, it turns out there is another scientific study out, this time on Greenland's ice, and I hate to say it, ladies and gentlemen, but you can probably see where this is going. It's not good news. A reading from the University of California, Irvine's website, quote, Greenland's icy reaches are far more vulnerable to warm ocean waters from climate change than have been thought, according to new research by UC Irvine and NASA glaciologists. The work published today in Nature Geoscience shows previously uncharted deep valleys stretching for dozens of miles under the Greenland ice sheet. The bedrock canyons sit well below sea level, meaning that as subtropical Atlantic waters hit the fronts of hundreds of glaciers, those edges will erode much faster than had been assumed and release far greater amounts of water. End quote. So these scientists actually discovered these gigantic valleys that are literally melting underneath, which is crazy. But the ultimate end result of this is you know, that people always talk that Greenland was going to go, but it means that the Greenland melt is going to happen that much faster. And because of these valleys underneath there, they actually, before they knew this, they thought Greenland might melt a little bit and then stop. But because of these valleys, it looks like they're going to start and sort of keep going. So, in fact, one of the scientists, Jason Box, actually told Think Progress, he said, quote, it's like a terrible competition between Greenland and Antarctica for biggest loser. Multiple factors have been combining to produce surprisingly rapid change. This is the hallmark of a system unable to catch up with an exponentially increasing forcing, end quote. This is another major climate change story that is really, really drastic, really, really important. But I actually want to move on to a related climate change story. So you may actually remember we covered maybe a couple of months ago the latest Pentagon study on the effects of climate change. If you don't remember that, the Pentagon report actually said that climate change will cause, quote, poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, social tensions, conditions that can enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence, end quote. And again, let me be clear, the source of that quote isn't me, Mr. Lefty Matthew Filipowicz here. The source of that quote isn't the Sierra Club, isn't 350.org, it isn't some hippie here, it's not some granola crunching hippie, no. That is the Pentagon saying that climate change is going to cause poverty, degradation, political instability, terrorism. That is what the Pentagon is reporting. Again, not some granola cruncher here, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the Pentagon. So the Pentagon, ladies and gentlemen, believes in the science of climate change. The Pentagon believes that climate change is a threat to U.S. national security. That's what the Pentagon does. They do all these studies actually studying what is a threat to U.S. national security. The Pentagon believes in the science of climate change. And apparently the fact that the Pentagon believes in science upset some members of Congress. So much so, folks, that last week, the latest defense authorization bill actually had the following amendment added to it. This amendment was actually authored by Republican David McKinley. I believe he's from West Virginia. But this is the text of his amendment that was added to the Defense Authorization Act. Quote, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated or otherwise made available by this act may be used to implement the U.S. Global Change Research Program National Climate Assessment, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report, the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Plan, or the May 2013 technical update of the social cost of carbon for regulatory impact analysis under executive order. End quote. I know that sounds a little technical, but let me just give you the gist of what that actually means, folks. The United States House of Representatives, my friends, are ordering the Pentagon to ignore climate change. Again, even though the Pentagon is well aware of the threats to the United States from our lack of action on the climate, the House of Representatives wants them to ignore all of those threats. And again, just to kind of talk about the hypocrisy, not just of like climate deniers, because that's well spoken. I mean, again, like I said last week when we were talking about climate, these are people who use science all the time but still deny science, whatever. But more specifically, I want to talk about the hypocrisy of people, especially on the right wing, it's more on the right wing, who always talk about how great the Pentagon is, who always talk about how great our military is, how great our military leaders are, how we must honor our military leaders, listen to our military leaders because they know what they're talking about because they're with the military. They talk and talk and talk about how much they love the military. And here, when you have the military saying that climate change is a threat to the United States, these same people who are constantly waving little flags about how much they love the military are saying, hold on a second. How dare you, military? How dare you, Pentagon, say that climate change is real? How dare you, Pentagon, say that climate change is a threat? You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to wave little American flags. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to actually talk about the actual threat of climate change. And so, literally, they vote and tell the Pentagon to ignore the looming devastation that's coming to the United States and the globe from climate change. And these scumbags have the gall to say that they're patriots. They have the gall to say that they love the military. And by the way, this was a Republican-authored amendment, and most Democrats voted against the amendment. But the truth is, the whole bill did actually pass the House of Representatives 325 to 98. So a lot of Democrats did in fact vote for the final bill. I know a lot of you Democrat apologists will say something like, well, they have to vote for the defense authorization bill. If not, they'll be deemed unpatriotic. But again, you could also turn that around on Republicans if you chose, because here you have these Republicans who claim to be patriots, who at the same exact time are ignoring what the Pentagon is telling them when it comes to the actual threat of climate change. There's actually another story on climate that I wanted to get to today here. You all remember back in 2012 in North Carolina, the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission, they had a scientific study that found that the sea level rise in North Carolina is actually going to be around 3 feet. This is actually before some of these newer studies have come out, and actually looks like it's going to be closer by the end of the century, probably closer to 7 feet. But so this commission in North Carolina said, looks like we're having by the next century 3 levels of sea rise here in North Carolina. We should probably, because we care about North Carolinians, we care about our citizens, we care about our property, we should probably start preparing for that fact. Well, you may remember that after that study, the North Carolina legislature voted to ban that study. And that's not all they did. A little summary from Think Progress here. The panel's, quote, this is from Think Progress, quote, the panel's 3-foot rise projection offended the Republican legislature enough that in 2012, it voted to officially ignore it. Hoping to avoid a repeat, the panel will now only look at sea level 30 years in the future. North Carolina's war on science hasn't ended there either. There was another incident with the North Carolina Department of Environment and National Resources was caught deleting public resources about climate change. End quote. So, again, North Carolina, we talked about this when it happened back in 2012, but they decided to stick their heads deep in their fastly eroding sand and ignore science, the science that's staring them in the face. But again, that's actually not all. There's actually an update on this story. Just this last week, and it was actually reported that North Carolina is going to go even further in their battle on science, even further on their battle of ignoring the fact that most of their coast is in danger. Then they actually, their Coastal Resources Commission, the one that is warning them about rising sea levels, they're actually now going to be, they're going to try to change them to be staffed by I know you're going to be surprised about this. They want the Coastal Resources Commission to be staffed by climate change deniers. I mean, look, they might as well, though, right? I mean, they might as well, if they're going to ignore the science, they might as well not have these studies to begin with. If they're going to ignore what the science says, why even have scientists there to begin with? It's ridiculous, right? But back to the kind of the bigger point I want to make here today. Dear God, folks, this is 2014. 2014. And here in the United States of America, we have politicians not only ignoring science, but actively voting to suppress science. It's so crazy. I mean, how many of you are watching Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos? If you're not, you should. It's a really, really fun show. I enjoyed it a lot. It's just a fun, goofy science show that's really, really interesting. But pretty much every week on the Cosmos, they show how scientists in the past were scorned and ignored and sometimes imprisoned. And we're talking about all the way back to the dawn of man, all the different scientists who were, laughed at because they discovered something. And, you'd think we might have evolved from that. But here we are in 2014, and politicians in the United States of America are voting and passing laws demanding that we ignore science. Dear God, what the hell is wrong with us? I mean, look, climate change is coming. No, forget that. Climate change is already bloody here. I mean, again, look at the studies. Look at the ice that is right now melting in Greenland and the Antarctic. It is literally happening right now as I'm speaking right now. And not only can we can't even get any action to try to combat climate change, any action to try to lessen the impact. We can't get that. Not only can we not get that, our bloody politicians are demanding that our military, whose mission on paper is to protect the safety and lives of Americans, they are ordering our military to ignore the science that will lead to the deaths of American citizens. It is madness. It is utter madness. And again, when studies like this come out, it is hard not to think that we, as a country, deserve the consequences that we're going to get from climate change. And look, as Americans, the richest country, the people that pollute the most on the planet, the truth is we probably do deserve this. But the fact about the matter is climate change, it doesn't just affect us. It doesn't just affect the United States of America. It affects the entire globe. And initially, once all of these consequences start rolling out in the next century or so, ultimately it's going to affect all of us. But initially, the people who are going to feel these consequences of our lack of action in combating climate change, the people who are going to feel the consequences first are the poor and disadvantaged, not just in America, but all over the world. We'll be right back.